Welcome back to the Lincoln Project. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by Garrett Graff, author, historian, and founding director of Aspen Institute's cyber initiatives. Garrett's the publisher of the Substack newsletter, Doomsday Scenario, and the host of the podcast Long Shadow, now in its second season, and available wherever fine podcasts are found. Garrett's also a contributor to Wired and CNN, has written for a multitude of publications, including Esquire, Rolling Stone, and the New York Times, and has edited Washingtonian and Politico magazine. As an author, he's written a number of books, including his latest title, Watergate, A New History. Today, he's coming to us from Burlington, Vermont. Garrett, thanks for coming back.
Thanks so much for having me, Reed.
So before we start talking about the other things, have you watched the White House Plumbers show on HBO?
I actually have. I got to be the sort of resident historian on the companion podcast that HBO did. So I'm the person that they call in to say after every episode, did that really happen? And the answer in almost all the cases is yes. And actually, it was even weirder at the time than they make it out to be.
No, and I know it's a little bit off topic, but as someone who was lucky enough to work in the executive office building, the EEOB, they did a pretty good job recreating that, and you can imagine being in those offices, with these guys. And as someone who grew up in the Washington D.C. area, I think Justin Theroux does a pretty good job of mimicking G. Gordon Liddy's very unique sort of affect and attitude towards things.
Yeah, I mean, that is, I think, what really comes through in the Plumbers is. G. Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt are these two, highly imaginative wackos who really have no business being anywhere close to the presidency.
Right.
And in any normal administration would have never gotten anywhere close to the presidency, but are really sort of acting out Richard Nixon's id inside the EEOB, with shockingly little oversight from what is otherwise known as one of the best run and most organized White Houses of all time.
Right. And look, sometimes history maybe doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does echo. So let's talk about you've had a podcast, The Long Shadow. It's now in its second season, where you're focusing on the rise of right-wing extremism, and frankly, not just the rise of it, but the longevity of it. Its origins, the different paths it's taken as we get here to 2023. If you haven't listened to it, folks who are watching and listening, please do so. Download it. Garrett does an exceptional job hosting it. It's also a very well-produced podcast, so you'll hear a lot. You'll be very immersed in it. So, Garrett, give us a little sense of why you decided, why now, that this was something you wanted to take on.
Yeah, and Reed, this is a story that you have followed and lived as well. I'm a historian and journalist, have spent 20 years covering the war on terror and the rise of DHS and the fight against Al Qaeda and ISIS and all of these other foreign threats. Mm-hmm. And then the thing that really stands out when you listen to national security leaders talk these days is the extent to which they think that the biggest threat facing America is now here at home, and that it is the threat of right-wing extremism, and specifically the rise and sort of mainstreaming of white supremacy and the globalization of white supremacy. And in fact, it's actually, we're talking here Monday, May 15th, this weekend, Joe Biden at his commencement address at Howard University cited white supremacy as the most pressing threat against the country right now. And that's very consistent with, what DHS has been saying, what the FBI has been saying, what other sort of national intelligence and national security leaders have said over the last 4 or 5 years. And so my goal with this podcast was to try to take that threat and break it down and explain where it came from. And that, for all of us who were paying attention on January 6th, there was this sense that, this attack came out of nowhere. I mean, sort of came out of nowhere in the same way that the attack on 9/11 came out of nowhere. But if you were paying attention, if you had seen the rise of Al-Qaeda and the rise of Islamic extremism through the 1990s, 9/11 was in some ways an entirely predictable result of where that threat was growing.
Which even a national intelligence estimate said that.
Exactly. You had that August 6th, 2001 PDB, Osama bin Laden determined to strike inside the United States. And that this is, I think, the same story in some ways that we are living with January 6th, where you have had this threat that sort of corners of the U.S. government have been paying attention to on and off for many, many years, but not handling particularly well. And a big part of this podcast is also tracing the government's own failures, both in terms of prosecutions and sort of intelligence screw-ups along the way that ultimately help feed some of this threat as well. So that was the backdrop. And then, this spring was the 30th anniversary of the siege at the Branch Davidian compound at Waco, Texas. So this sort of particular season of Long Shadow was tied to that, and then of course the date of April 19th, 1993, 30 years ago, last month, when there was the fiery end of the siege that ended up killing 76 Branch Davidians at the end of a 51-day siege, begun after a disastrous raid by the ATF that ended with the deaths of 4 ATF agents and the largest law enforcement shootout in American history, the largest gun battle on American soil since the Civil War. And that Waco event really becomes the spark for that inspires the modern far-right movement. And it is, of course, that anniversary, April 19th, that Timothy McVeigh then chooses to blow up the Oklahoma City Federal Building 2 years later on April 19th, 1995.
Well, and I would say we would also be remiss, based on what you said about President Biden's remarks, that this weekend also marked the 1-year anniversary of the Buffalo supermarket massacre as well. So there's just too much of this stuff, I think, going on for certainly decency's sake, but for anybody to feel good, I think, sometimes. But let's go back to the beginning. So, look, race is a continuous thread in our politics going back to well before the founding, at the Civil War. In the wake of the Civil War, Reconstruction, the KKK pops up. I think Ulysses Grant spent a lot of his presidency trying to eradicate them. They come back 50 or 60 years later, right? Those statues of Robert E. Lee and those guys didn't pop up in 1868. They popped up in 1908 or sometime around there.
Right. Yes.
And so we've seen is sort of an ebbing and flowing of this, the 50s with desegregation and the 60s with the civil rights movement. And now you get into the 1980s, right? And so much of this is centered in the Pacific Northwest, or maybe the inland Northwest, Garrett, which is northern Idaho, Sandpoint. So take us, how do these folks in the 80s find one another? And I do want to spend some time on, the government's actions and reactions to things, because I think that's an important piece of this. But tell us where let's say, what's the modern iteration? And a modern, I say, in the last, say, 40 years or so.
Yeah, and that's really what the arc of the story that we try to tell is right. That modern story beginning from the 1980s up to today. And a lot of it actually ends up being driven by sort of waves of wars overseas. Mm-hmm. And you sort of see 3 cycles of this over the course of the story. The sort of origins of this modern far-right movement in the wake of Vietnam and the disillusionment of returning veterans from that. Then, of course, Tim McVeigh, part of the era of returning Gulf War veterans, right. Sort of disillusioned by that war, returning and susceptible to far-right extremism. And then, of course, the modern era, where you have a lot of this, being traced back to the disillusionment of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, I want to be sort of very clear that obviously that this is not in any way exclusively a movement of disillusioned veterans. Right. There are, of course, lots of veterans who return. The vast majority of veterans, return from war and serve honorably and return honorably to society here. But that there is sort of a consistent thread of sort of these military experiences overseas helping to fuel resurgences of far-right extremism here at home as they come back.
But many of those, like a McVeigh or someone else, they also become the targets of people who are trying to recruit for these things, right?
Exactly. And that's really where the sort of rub of this hits, is that the sort of ideological leaders of this movement sort of latch on to returning veterans as sort of particularly good targets of opportunity because of their military training, because of their weapons training, and so forth. But what you see in the 1970s and the early 1980s as this modern movement comes together in the wake of Vietnam is that, as you said, white supremacy has always been a backdrop of American politics. What changes in the civil rights movement is that you see groups like the Ku Klux Klan that had long been basically extensions of the state,
right,
sort of particularly in the South.
And I don't think we spend enough time on that, Garrett, to be honest with you.
Yeah. That like, high-ranking KKK leaders in the South are, local sheriffs and elected officials and, governors. Right. And that what happens in the wake of the civil rights movement is, the KKK comes to see itself not as vigilantes sort of supporting the white supremacist governments, but as people who sort of hope to overthrow the U.S. government. And this begins to come together in the late 1970s and early 80s with groups like the Order and what's known as CSA, the Covenant, the Sword, and the Lord of the Arm of the Lord. These big white supremacy groups, again, as you said, largely centered around the Pacific Northwest and Oregon and Idaho. The Aryan Nations comes together. And they are inspired by this book, The Turner Diaries, which of course becomes an infamous book in the 1990s. Was a key part of Tim McVeigh's radicalization and his extremism. But it was written written under a pseudonym, actually by a guy named William Pierce, who becomes one of the original sort of founders of this modern movement when he breaks off of the American Nazi Party. So, this is someone who's literally saying, the Nazis aren't extreme enough for me, so I'm going to go off and form my even more extreme effort. And the Turner Diaries is this, sort of dystopian, apocalyptic novel that's really a how-to manual of how right-wing extremists provoke a race war, overthrow the U.S. government, and then sort of found, the all-white nation that they hope to achieve. And this becomes the backdrop against which you see groups like the Order and CSA and the Aryan Nations sort of come together and organize over the course of the 1980s, ultimately leading to a series of government crackdowns and eventually, again, there are some parallels that will sound familiar to people with the modern day. A big trial in Fort Smith, Arkansas, where the leaders of the white power movement are charged with seditious conspiracy. Of course, the charge brought against the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys in the wake of the January 6th insurrection. And that this is, so in the podcast, we sort of try to tell the origins of these stories and how this history comes to influence, that generation and then the follow-on generations, and sort of introduce people to the roots of this modern movement.
And so, you talk about, and let's talk about the legal aspect of this first, which is there were times, and it might have been the CSA trial in Fort Smith, and I think maybe another one as well, where the government not only didn't prove its case, it did a terrible job trying to prove its case in a couple of these examples. And in one, you said that I think it was a weapons charges these guys were accused of, and they actually, the feds had to hand their weapons back to them as soon as the verdict was read. So what was it? Was it that the government, the federal, because now you sort of think about federal prosecutors, like if they're going to trial with you, it's because you have not been smart enough to take a deal with them, right?
Yep.
Because they're not going to try this unless they know they got you dead to rights. So what was the difference then as opposed to now?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating thread of this story for most of 40 years, is that the U.S. government sort of decade after decade after decade screws up the prosecutions of almost every single meaningful right-wing plotter and extremist. The Fort Smith, Arkansas trial, it was a uniquely dysfunctional circus. Two of the jurors actually have romantic relationships with the defendants, which, I'm not a jury expert, but I believe that that's the type of thing that's frowned upon normally while the trial is going on.
Right.
And they are the leaders of these three groups, the Order, the CSA, and the Aryan Nations, are all fully acquitted by an all-white jury in Arkansas amid this sort of disastrous series of prosecutions. And as you said, at the end of it, the U.S. government, which thought that this was going to be, the trial that breaks the back of the white power movement in America and sentences all of their leaders to decades in prison, ends up actually having to give them all their guns back at the end of it. And that this sadly becomes part of the drumbeat of how these cases unfold. And, sort of episode after episode, we look at how the U.S. government takes swings at this threat over and over and keeps missing.
And I don't know, was it the Order or the Aryan Nations where they're knocking over banks and armored cars, in things that are reminiscent of, Heat, right? Or
Yes.
Hollywood movies where, they're on a lonely stretch of highway in Central California or something. And, they say, you guys can leave, or, you guys can die. And so there was a crime spree with some of these folks, I assume, to finance the operations. But violence, in addition to the white supremacy, they go hand in hand with these guys. And I guess
Yes,
a willingness to use that violence.
Yeah, not just a willingness to use the violence, but violence is sort of a key part of the goal here. The violence is how they expect that they are going to be able to provoke the race war that is necessary to overthrow the U.S. government and do away with the Jews and the blacks. And so the Order, as you mentioned, is responsible for, in the 1980s, for the largest open road robbery in American history. They knock over a Brinks truck in California for over $3 million in cash. They rob a variety of other stores and banks. They assassinate a Denver talk radio host who sort of called them out for their anti-Semitism. And, they really hoped that this violence was the start of revolution. And this becomes a key part. This is a key part of the the Turner Diaries and the mission and the dream of the Turner Diaries, but it's also, where we see someone like Tim McVeigh get the idea to blow up the Oklahoma City Federal Building.
Right. So I want to get back to radio hosts because that's a key part of this. But let's talk about the things that if you're a student of American history and certainly of domestic political history, there's Ruby Ridge and Randy Weaver and his family. Obviously, you mentioned Waco, and Waco has a little bit of personal resonance for me because I think, as I've noted on the show before, Garrett, I was a junior in high school when that went down in Dallas. And I remember sitting in my room on the phone with a buddy of mine, and video comes on Channel 21 on the TV, and you see this. And I don't think it was live. I think they beam the footage in, but you see ATF agents climbing ladders, and then you see bullets flying out, and one guy roll off the roof, and I'm like, what is going on here? Fast forward to April 19th, they roll televisions into our classrooms, Garrett, as this happens, and a bunch of 17-year-olds in Spanish class watch this thing burn to the ground. It was bananas. But talk about, because I bring those two things up because it was something you mentioned at the beginning, which was Randy Weaver. They sent basically a plant in because they were trying to get him out of his hidey hole in the middle of nowhere. They're going to get him on charges of sawing off a shotgun. They send marshals out to get him. They end up killing his kid and his dog, right? Because admittedly, his wife, but the young man, his son, was armed and shot at them. Yes. So I don't want to make it seem like they're just out there killing kids and dogs. But then they call in the FBI. But the FBI special, the hostage rescue team or whatever out of Quantico believes that this is an ongoing firefight, right? And they get there and it's not. The ATF in Waco needs a big score. They need a big thing, a big flashy thing, because they want to have, they don't want to be the little brother to the FBI anymore. And it becomes, this debacle, I think we can all agree, 30 years on. So what was going on with federal law enforcement 30 years ago where this stuff was so poorly either planned or handled as it was going down?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it says a lot about the attention that federal law enforcement had to this as a threat along the way. It has a lot to say about how, in many ways, the government sort of worst enemy in far-right extremism is often the government. That right. It is the government sort of missteps and miscalculations along the way that provide real fodder for this movement's growth and the rise of the militia movement through the 1990s. And we see, the militia movement, I think one of the things that we misunderstand that we try to correct in the podcast is thinking of these militia groups, right-wing militia groups, as, benevolent patriots against the government. And it's actually a very conscious decision by the leaders of the white power movement in the early 1990s that are basically like, if we take all of the stuff that we believe and sort of downplay the naked white supremacy of it all, we can attract a wider set of adherents to our beliefs. And so you end up sort of wrapping up these people like Randy Weaver, who's like sort of a white supremacist, but not a real virulent one. But he sort of goes to some of the Aryan Nation gatherings in northwest Idaho, and then ends up, basically the ATF tries to get him as an informant, doesn't work. They hit him with a gun charge. He then sort of retreats to his mountain cabin, and the government is sort of stuck with this case that they don't actually really care about at all. Randy Weaver really means nothing to them, but you can't defy the federal government forever. And so, the U.S. Marshals sort of start trying to get him down off the mountain. They, arrest him at one point. He then, send him to court. Then he doesn't show up for his court date, and they're sort of stuck dealing with this guy again. And it spirals, as you say, into this, really poorly handled shootout and siege on Ruby Ridge a year before the Waco siege, which is also terribly poorly handled. And then, and these things are, all end up creating this narrative of the government coming after people's guns, the people sort of coming at the government coming after people for their religion. And
so they sort of swap the narrative to, we want to overthrow the government, to, why won't the government just leave us alone?
Yes, and you see then in the wake of the Waco siege, the passage of the assault weapons ban, which is one of those things that is sort of long forgotten, by most of America, but very much remembered by gun rights activists. And it really seems like this is the worst case scenario. This is the tyrannical U.S. government, coming to kill, women and children and, religious activists and take away the guns of law-abiding citizens. And it sparks together this movement of the far-right militias in the 1990s that really helps radicalize people like Tim McVeigh, and ultimately leads to the Oklahoma City federal bombing. And one of the things that we really try to tell is this story with Tim McVeigh is that, for almost 30 years now, America sort of has this lie that we tell ourselves about Tim McVeigh, that he was a lone wolf, that, he carried out this, deadliest bombing on U.S. soil up until that moment, that's still the deadliest bombing by a domestic extremist, and that he sort of did it totally by himself with the help of an army buddy, Terry Nichols, and a third guy, Michael Fortier. And that's not really true. And when you dive into Tim McVeigh, what you see is that he comes right out of this right-wing extremist movement. He's a believer in the Turner Diaries. He is traveling around to gun shows in the years before the bombing, selling copies of the Turner Diaries, selling anti-government T-shirts and bumper stickers. That he actually goes to Waco to the siege to sort of see up close firsthand the tyrannical government at work punishing the Branch Davidians, and that he's actually a relatively active member of the far right extremist movement right up until that moment when he drives into Oklahoma City wearing a T-shirt that he made for himself that day that says "Sic Semper Tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. The motto, of course, that John Wilkes Booth shouts as he shoots Abraham Lincoln.
Right, and so let me ask you this. Let me take a step out, maybe not back, but so you've mentioned several times about the overthrow of the government, of the federal government, the United States federal government, and this idea of this sort of white Christian nationalist, white supremacist sort of paradise, I guess. But these don't seem to be the types that are capable of that. So are they necessarily living in a fantasy land that has these continual, very violent interactions with reality?
I think that's accurate. That they see themselves as people trying to spark a revolution, and that they are they are the heroes of their own story, and they really think that these moments, these actions, are what is going to spark that sort of final race war that brings down the federal government and leads to what at the end of the Turner Diaries is known as the Day of the Rope, which is this mass execution by the winners, by the white, the newly installed white government, white power movement at the end of the Turner Diaries, of journalists and Jews and blacks and minorities and sort of everyone that they see as what they call a race traitor, and that this Turner Diary narrative is one that is incredibly powerful, and it's one that you really see, I think, actually even the echoes of on January 6th itself. I mean, it is not a coincidence that you've got people building a gallows on the grounds of the U.S. Capitol, and you've
screaming,
got
"Hang Mike
people
Pence,"
and screaming, "Hang Mike Pence." I mean, this is the moment that, in many ways, the Turner Diaries tries to build towards.
So before we get to January 6th, let's talk a little bit about Cliven Bundy. And a lot of this occurs in the West, right? If you live in the West, as I do, a lot of it's vastly empty. The vast majority of it's empty. It's, a lot of places from, New Mexico north to, Montana, Wyoming, right? Most of the places you might live are pretty inhospitable. And so in the old days, you really had to want to be there, right? You had to want to be here. There's also the sort of manifest destiny of go west, young man, and everything else, and this sort of freedom and fresh air and mountains. But Cliven Bundy, and his clan in Nevada, right? They're basically, out on, having their cattle out grazing on federal land. They're not paying their fees or whatever it is, and it leads to the standoff. I think it was in 2014. Correct me if I'm wrong, Garrett. But now you have the flip, which is it's 180 degrees away from Ruby Ridge or Waco, which is, the feds are going to come, they're going to herd up his cattle, and then there's going to be a standoff. But the last thing any of us are going to do on the federal side is pull a trigger.
Yes, and this becomes, as you said, a lot of this story takes place in the West, and some of that has to do with, as you said, the manifest destiny of the sense of and spirit of the American West. And some of this is also the story of how the relationship with the federal government is also just so different out west, that the fifth episode of this season, as you talk about, is all about the Bundys, and sort of this modern Western land rights, grazing rights showdown, where you have the BLM, this agency that most people in the East in the United States pay almost no attention to whatsoever, the Bureau of Land Management, but that out west is the holder of 1/8 of the entire country, and in states,
and knowing a BLM agent is not an unusual thing.
Right. And that in Nevada, in Utah, in Idaho, more than half of the entire state is actually owned by the federal government, overseen by the Park Service and the Forest Service and the BLM, and that you sort of have a much more sort of in your face contact with the federal government. I live in Vermont here. My sort of sense of the federal government is, there are some air traffic controllers who are paying attention, when I'm flying. There's some USDA meat inspectors working to make sure that my hamburger tastes okay. But sort of, there's not a lot of sort of federal government.
No, it's abstract.
intersecting with me in my daily life. And that's actually, for Western ranchers, sort of this is a daily interaction with them. And so for Cliven Bundy, this rancher in Nevada, he is in this sort of decades-long showdown with the BLM over grazing rights. And it, gets to sort of all of the sense of, sort of Gadsden flag, don't tread on me, America of, who are you to tell me where I can and cannot graze my cattle, and a lot of these really complex trade-offs with the Endangered Species Act and, local development rights and, all of these weird, stories that seem very abstract when you're reading about them in, the New York Times and are very lived experiences for people out West. And that he ends up in this showdown in 2014 with the BLM and, the tyrannical Obama government. I mean, we sort of forget how much of this movement really sort of changed and was turbocharged by the election of a black president in 2008.
And can you just spend a little bit more time on that? Because I think that's one thing that certainly, until listening to you and doing all the reading I have now done in the last 2 or 3 years, and again, as someone who was, look, I worked for John McCain, right? Did I think that Obama should be president? I don't know. Frankly, it doesn't matter now. I knew he was going to be president, but, me personally, Garrett, like I never went to bed at night saying, well, he's not, I'm a Republican, he's a Democrat, but like I didn't worry about the country. Does that make sense?
Right.
Like I didn't go to bed at night going, oh God, what's Obama going to do next? But for so many of these folks, the very fact that he was the first black president was just a bridge too far for them.
Yes, and you see this immediate resurgence of, white supremacy, white power groups, huge uptick in, the resurgence of militias across the country. And some of that has to do with this like very weird moment that, you and I, when we were in Washington in the early 2000s, sort of didn't realize we were really living through in the time.
Right.
But that sort of right-wing extremism sort of largely goes away for the early 2000s. You have a Republican president in office, and you have this unified enemy overseas that, Al-Qaeda, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden, it seemed like for the first time in
since the end of the Cold War, probably.
Right. That, the right wing and the government were on the same side fighting the same enemy.
Right.
There was a lot of dark stuff going on right then, a lot of Islamophobia in the United States. Like, I don't want to gloss over that, but you didn't see this sort of active right-wing militia movement in the way that sort of immediately pops back up with Barack Obama, which, by the way,
would you say that they disbanded, or was it more that they went underground like cicadas?
I think both, because some of it is, a lot of these groups are not sort of formal in the way that, you're, mustering people in and out of a regiment. This is, these are groups that sort of have a sort of amorphous membership on their sort of best day. And so,
and they all live on literally and figuratively on the fringes of society. So there's a good chance that somebody's always getting picked up for a warrant or for cooking meth or something else, right? So people are coming and going all the time.
And you have this other thing that really turbocharges in the early 2000s, and particularly around the election of President Obama, which is right-wing talk radio and right-wing media, specifically Fox News.
Right.
We are sort of so used to, in 2023, thinking of Fox News as a scourge on our democratic, on our democracy.
Right.
that we sort of forget that that's actually a relatively recent invention.
Right.
That, Fox in the 1990s, after it's originally founded, like, yeah, it's right wing, but like, it's not crazy.
Right.
It's not Tucker Carlson out there, spewing white supremacy on a nightly basis.
No, I mean it was fair and balanced, right? It was all of that. I mean, you think about it, it was Hannity and Colmes, right?
Yep.
Like, I mean, they had a Democrat. There was a fair. My dad was on TV most weekends with a guy named Bob Beckel, who was a longtime Democratic analyst,
Yep.
and they were asked generally straight questions about American politics.
Yeah, and they did like entertainment coverage and travel coverage. Like
Right.
it was, it was sort of like more than like headline news version of CNN rather than the conservative talk radio. And then you have sort of real polarization begin to come into place in those 2000s in ways that are big and small, right? Like we're so used to thinking of the country today in terms of red states and blue states, that really only arrives in the 2000 election.
Right.
Before the 2000 election, America didn't have red states and blue states in the way that we think of it. There were some states that were more Republican than others. There were some states that were more Democratic than others, but we didn't call them red states and blue states. And
it wasn't a means of self-identification either.
Exactly. And where that actually comes from is the 2000 election, where you have that actually election to election up until 2000, different channels and different networks changed back and forth, whether blue represents Democrats or red represents Republicans. In 1996, it was actually blue was the color for Republicans and red was the color for Democrats. But in 2000, the paralysis of the Florida vote means that America gets used to looking at those electoral charts in the daily newspapers and on the cable channel sort of day after day after day,
right,
for weeks at a time. And we sort of begin to sort of look at the country in terms of red and blue in a way that we did not before 2000. And then over the course of the rest of that decade, you see sort of the radicalization of Fox News, the radicalization of conservative talk radio, sort of the spread of this new sort of insidious conspiracism with talk radio hosts like Glenn Beck and Alex Jones. Again,
but let's go back even further than that. Remind me the guy's name in Arizona who's like broadcasting over shortwave radio, because he seems to be sort of like the godfather of all of this.
Yes. This was one of my favorite parts of this whole season. Episode 4, we spend looking at the rise of conservative media and specifically the rise of Bill Cooper. Mm-hmm. And Bill Cooper is this figure, and I will sort of shift slightly to say, so my next book comes out in November, and it's a history of the U.S. government's hunt for UFOs. Sort of the real, weird stuff that happened over the last 75 years with UFOs. Bill Cooper is this ex-Navy intelligence officer who comes out of the UFO conspiracy theory world. And becomes one of the leading UFO conspiracists of the 1980s, and then reinvents himself in the 1990s as a talk radio host. And he ends up with one very specific protege, a guy named Alex Jones, the voice of Austin Public Access.
Right.
And where does Alex Jones get his start? Well, actually, it's in the ashes of Waco, Texas. He sort of the first big thing that Alex Jones does is he raises the money to rebuild the church at the site of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. And this becomes sort of his big national breakout moment. And he then, sort of goes sort of ever more deeper into conspiracy theories,
Right.
is sort of a key figure in the Y2K conspiracy movement, which is where sort of he and Bill Cooper really have their falling out.
Right, which is an interesting part of episode 4, Garrett, because it comes to a point where when you have some clips that you play of this guy, Bill Cooper, who is kooky as all get out, and then at some point he decides that Alex Jones is too kooky even for him.
Yes, because the thing that is sort of fascinating about this ideological split is that Bill Cooper doesn't think he himself is a liar. Whereas he sort of sees Alex Jones as an actual liar.
Right.
And for him, like, that's a bridge too far. You get this great platform, all of these listeners, and you can't lie to them. You got to tell the truth. And he ends up, having this sort of vicious split with Alex Jones in the wake of Y2K. And then, spoiler alert, but this happened, 21 years ago, so it's not that much of a spoiler alert, ends up dying shortly after 9/11 in a shootout with police in Arizona, as he, Bill Cooper, sort of gets ever kookier and crazier. Right. And then Alex Jones, his career sort of takes off after 9/11 like a rocket. And that he becomes such a key voice in this movement and the radicalization and the sort of spread of these pernicious conspiracies up to and including, of course, birtherism, which, circling back to Obama, becomes sort of a key part of how the right sort of, loses its mind with the election of Barack Obama
and Donald Trump and the birth certificate. And right.
Exactly. And that you sort of begin to see, again, all of these threads coming together, threads that sort of start in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, sort of weaving themselves together in the 2000s, and resulting eventually in the Bundy standoff, which is sort of
right.
where we were starting this question in 2014. And the Bundys become this incredible moment where the federal government moves in to take the cattle off of federal land, taxpayer land,
right.
that the Bundys have been grazing on without paying their grazing fees. And the Bundys put out a call for militias to come, and a whole lot of militias show up. People like the Oath Keepers, people like Stuart Rhodes.
Right.
And they end up in this showdown with the BLM, and eventually the BLM backs down. Yada, yada, yada. A couple years pass. There are 2 other showdowns that this moment sort of helps inspire. One at the Sugar Pine Mine in Oregon. Then the Bundys, for sort of other reasons, which I encourage you to listen to the podcast and get all of this. They end up seizing a national wildlife refuge in outside Bend, Oregon,
right.
And lead what is, by sort of any other account, an armed, takeover of federal property, and which again they escape from, and again the government screws up the prosecution. And the Bundys end up leading 2 armed standoffs against the federal government in 2014 and 2016 that are successful. And it ends up, I think, being, you look at January 6th and you see the roots of that really taking hold in these armed standoffs out west, where people get the idea that you can stand up to the federal government and you can win.
So let's fast forward a little bit. So we've talked about the groups in the 80s and the 90s. We know most about, let's say, Waco and the Branch Davidians. But now, and you talked about this guy, Bill Cooper and Alex Jones. I think that probably Rush Limbaugh is in that, right? And right-wing radio has always been both a very popular and very efficient means of moving messages. And I don't know if it was in your podcast or another where someone was mentioning, right-wing radio host Lars Larson. And I remember that Larson was, I don't know if he was based in California. He was very popular in California with California Republicans. And yeah, he was a right-winger, but he wasn't any crazier at the time necessarily, and this is over 10 years ago, than your average California Republican who really, I think if you want to look at where the beginning of the end of, the GOP I knew, look to California, right? You can see all of the sort of seeds of its descent, I guess is a better way to put it. But what is it about the right-wing radio guys that make them, I don't want to call it compelling because they're not compelling to me, but they're compelling to an awful lot of people.
Yeah. And this series is not meant to be sort of an autopsy of the, what happened to the Republican Party, but you sort of can't help but think about some of that. And to me, it has always been a story of when the movement of a movement where you have the sort of center of power of the GOP shift from people who are involved in politics and policy and people who are showing up who are actually interested in profit. Mm-hmm. And, Rush Limbaugh, these other conservative hosts, what they care about is the profit of their shows, mm-hmm. the power of their listenerships. And they sort of shift the center of gravity of the whole conservative movement by really, I think, making it one where the more extreme you are, the more power you have in the movement because you have these sort of vast tools of profit available to you. And right. Whether that's, Bill O'Reilly and his, killing book series, or whether that's, Sean Hannity.
As a historian, just as an aside, those must just make you crazy.
Yes. And, Sean Hannity and his talk radio, Alex Jones, these are people who are making tens of millions of dollars, radicalizing their listeners, without really having to ever answer to voters or enact policy or negotiate politics. And that this, I think, is where you begin to see the sort of split of the GOP from sort of the party that you knew, the party that I knew when I lived in Washington in the early 2000s, and where we sort of end up after, certainly the nomination of Donald Trump, but, I would argue sort of even, the election of Barack Obama.
Just one aside. So I think you mentioned in 1987, the Reagan administration ends the fairness doctrine, which basically said if you were going to spend 30 seconds on a right-wing issue, you had to spend 30 seconds on a left-wing issue. I'm probably vastly oversimplifying, but that was the basic idea, which was everybody had to have equal time to discuss whatever their issue was. That goes away, and I've tried to explain this to friends and allies, Garrett, which is when you look back at this stuff, and it could be the rise of right-wing, white nationalist extremism, or, the Federalist Society, or, how they the Turning Point USAs of the world and all of these things, is that so much of this stuff is not, to your point, and it's the whole point of your show, is not new, right? The sort of conservative youth movement stuff started at the 1964 Republican Convention for Goldwater. These things have been going on for decades and decades and decades, and now they all seem to come together, like the crossing of the streams in Ghostbusters, which is you're never supposed to have all of these things happening together, and now suddenly they do. Yes.
And that to me is really the story of this whole season, right. Is what we sort of started to try to tell in this season of Long Shadow was how the extreme became the mainstream, right. And that this movement that starts off with these truly extreme groups of the Order and CSA and the Aryan Nation in the 1980s becomes a force that helps inspire the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. And I would argue in the last, 3 years has moved only ever more to the mainstream of the Republican Party. That you have, white nationalists, white supremacists, white power adherents, not just on the fringes of the Republican Party today, but actually, holding elected office sort of up and down the political spectrum. And not just white supremacists, but, the rise of like QAnon conspiracy believers, which has a lot of roots in a lot of the story that we talk about in this season. Now you have, QAnon believers, in the halls of Congress itself, and,
9/11 truthers. Some of these people are all the same. Some of these people are all the same person.
Right. And often, the same person. And, you have Donald Trump, playing QAnon anthems at his rallies.
Right. Well, and just as to bring that up to, the present moment, in Doral, at the Doral Country Club in Florida, which is a Trump property, you had one speaker talking about blood libel, right, which is the idea that Jews kill Christian babies and drink their blood to live forever. That's really a thing they believe, folks. And then you had Michael Flynn, disgraced national security advisor, would be a felon, except that Trump, maybe you're always a felon even if you've been pardoned, former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, hold his cell phone up with Trump on the phone and says, when I get reelected, Michael, you're coming back in.
Yes.
Maybe the Germans have a word for this, Garrett, but like the level of insanity that describes is that why so many of us have so hard a time taking it seriously, that really believing it's going on?
I think that's some of it. I think some of it is, the sheer lunacy of so many of the key figures. You and I were both talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene a few minutes ago without actually mentioning her name. Right. Paul Gosar, who, has just been outed in the last, 24 hours as employing, particularly virulent, neo-Nazi staffer, who works with Nick Fuentes, another person that we really shouldn't have to care about at all in American politics, but is, someone who's, having dinner with Donald Trump. I think that there's a real challenge in a lot of this of like, we actually have to care about these people. Like these are people who by all rights should be the extreme far fringe of, a healthy right-wing movement in America. That there are, you and I were talking about this before we came on air, but, there are real wackos on the left too. And, they exist, but they are not dangerous and deadly in the same way that the extremists of the far right are. And the real wackos of the far left are treated like the real wackos of the far left. They are not considered the movers and shakers of the Democratic Party. And I say that as someone, represented in Vermont here by Bernie Sanders, who, is not actually one of the far left wackos that I'm mentioning here. Even as far left as he is, not a lunatic in the way that, you have the believers of the conspiracy theories on the far right as an active caucus of the Republican Party in Congress today.
But, you mentioned a conversation we were having before we went on air, and I told you I was relating a conversation I had with a dear friend of mine I've known for 2 decades. We worked together, staunch Republican, but I think a decent person, lives in a very red state. And, hearing him say, well, look, the crazies on the right, there are not that many of them. And, the crazies on the left are just as bad. And I had to say, like, that's first of all, that's just not the case. I said, there's a lot more crazies in the GOP than you want to believe. And he said, well, we just have these, Garrett, we have to have these debates where, everybody gets in a room and they debate policy. And I said, look, buddy, I love you. And I appreciate that you think that world can exist, but it doesn't. The party that we worked in is gone and it's never coming back. And, these are bad people and they run a lot of stuff. Well, Trump's, bad, but, the judiciary and taxes and everything else. And again, it was a very, lively but polite conversation, Garrett. But it seems to me, and I have this with a lot of my Republican friends, they're either unwilling or unable to see it. And I don't know how to sort of make the scales fall from their eyes. Maybe it's an impossibility. I don't know.
Yeah, and to be very frank, that was part of our goal with this series was, to try to trace some of the history of this as an ideological movement. And to show that this is not something that is, modern and organic and came from nowhere. This is a 40-year story of how white supremacy and white power groups made a lot of very conscious decisions, helped by people in places of influence, conservative talk radio, Fox News, and elsewhere, to mainstream, some of the worst traditions of American politics, up to and including, landing Donald Trump in the White House. And that this is something that we shouldn't think about in a vacuum. And we shouldn't think about as, if we just get rid of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar and we just defeat Lauren Boebert in Colorado, we get back to George Herbert Walker Bush and, Jim Baker and George Shultz running the country.
Right. And so let's talk about this. So, let's bring it up to January 6th, because, I mean, I remember my dad talking to my dad on January 6th, and he described his vision of watching what was happening at the Capitol. Like, you see that footage, that scary footage of when the water's rushing out from a beach right before a tsunami hits, and then it comes rushing back in. You're sort of like, what's happening here? What is this? What is this? And then before you know it, it's, literally or figuratively, the wave has crashed. But to your point, there were QAnon flags, there were Gadsden flags, there were Confederate flags. I don't think any of us can forget the guy, talking on the cell phone in the parking lot with the Camp Auschwitz T-shirt on. There's obviously the goon with the helmet and the horns. But and today, as we're recording, is National Peace Officers Memorial Day, I believe, and I say that because but for the bravery and quick thinking of a guy like Officer Eugene Goodman, we live in a very different country. So take us how all of these tendrils finally come together, where now you don't have a 2014 or 2016 where you have a Bundy standoff against the government, but now the executive branch is actively attacking the legislative branch.
Yes. Yeah. This is, I think one of the things that is much easier to tell with a little bit of hindsight is how these threads come together during the course of Donald Trump's presidency. And, you have this rise of a much more naked, much more virulent white power movement, beginning with that march in Charlottesville. And and then there's a gun rights rally in Virginia that you probably remember too, really sort of change the picture of what we're used to in political protest in America, where you have sort of guys in tactical gear with AR-15s, marching in stack formations through the crowd, in a way that we really didn't before Donald Trump arrived on the American political scene. most people didn't really want to bring their assault weapons to political events.
Or to the
And
Subway sandwich shop.
right, and that this, this is like this is something that's new and weird, and it's something worth talking about, and that it is very directly related to this, mainstreaming of extremism over the course of the 2000s. And you see it at the Bundy Ranch, you see it in these early Trump era protests in Richmond and Charlottesville.
Right.
And then you see, what to me is one of the sort of worst aspects of this, which is this rise of the politically inspired white supremacist mass shooting.
Right.
This globalization of the white power movement that takes place over the course of the Trump presidency, as mass shootings like the Charleston church shooting,
Right.
inspire
El Paso, Allen, Texas.
Exactly.
Tree of Life
Inspire
Synagogue.
other people to sort of further shootings, up to and including the horrific massacre in Christchurch, New Zealand.
Right.
Which, and to sort of show you how tightly these events are linked, the shooter in Christchurch specifically says in his manifesto that his goal is to inspire a race civil war in the United States with his massacre in New Zealand.
Right.
And that this becomes something that, you rattled them off there, the Tree of Life and El Paso and sort of all manner of awful
Right.
further mass shootings, all sort of tracing back to this same desire. You see the rise of the Proud Boys, which sort of starts as almost a joke,
Right.
ends up as this pretty violent, nasty, pro-Trump street gang. All of this explodes in the spring of 2020 with the COVID lockdowns and Trump's desire, liberate Michigan, liberate Virginia,
and guys with guns go into the Michigan State Capitol and bang on the door of the governor's office. Right. There's that image that's indelibly stuck in my head of the guy just screaming at a cop right in the face. And,
yes.
That's not normal. And I guess we should be thankful that, for the forbearance of those police officers, because, it would have been probably well within their rights and probably well within their instincts to say, you know what, I'm not sticking around for this guy anymore.
Yep. And you also, sort of imagine how all of those things then inspire, the crowd on January 6th to sort of think that it's okay to storm the Capitol.
Right.
They've done it before elsewhere. They've succeeded elsewhere. And you have this series of events, that goes from COVID through the George Floyd protests, the rise of, these militia groups as sort of this catch-all patriotic security force that is, showing up in places like Kenosha, where, Kyle Rittenhouse is one of these sort of freelance security guys, running around town with the Boogaloo Boys, one of these sort of wacky militia groups.
Right.
And
shoots
sort of,
3 people, kills 2 of them.
Exactly. And then is celebrated.
And I was just about to say that, because that's the one thing that is, is concerning. And let's be clear, most of social media has its tendency to be a cesspool, and the algorithms do that for us, unfortunately, and we're susceptible to it. Is how many people are like, he killed 2 of them, he shattered the other guy's arm, too bad he didn't have better aim, right? Like just really scary stuff from people whose accounts, like, I've known for, I don't want to say many years, but several years, who would not have said that 10 years ago.
Yep. And by the way, like, this is a thread that we are still seeing very much alive in in the heart of Republican politics today. Over the weekend we had Ron DeSantis tweeting about what a hero that Marine was in New York City for strangling a guy on the New York City subway who,
Right.
this sort of idea that, we need to kill more of our neighbors.
Right.
In
Vigilante
order
justice. Yeah.
yeah, sort of the sort of shoot first, ask questions later strain of heroism that I think is really, making America go crazy.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that would be my question, and this is less about the show, but more about just sort of your observation as someone who has, I think, a pretty good handle not only on American politics but also on American history, which is, is there a fever, that has to break? You've talked about how all of these things have come together. Do you have to pull one strand after another, or is it a natural, a natural sort of disillusion or it dissolves? Is it at the defeat of a Donald Trump? Is it the defeat of somebody else? Because I was reading something, a book earlier today, and it was like, when you live in the West, when you live in the United States, you always just assume, Garrett, that democracy is going to win over autocracy and capitalism is going to win over communism, right? It was another idiom. It was more of a Cold War idiom, but it still holds today, which is, I think a lot of us just make an assumption and, it's going to be fine. It's always been fine. Why wouldn't it be fine? And I think that's sort of the sleepwalking aspect that really worries me.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that is exactly where we are today, which is we are at a really pivotal moment in American politics. And we said this in 2020, we said this in the midterms, we're still in it.
Right.
This movement is not dead. It is, far from it. And it could very well still, it could come roaring back in 2024 and, destroy some of the foundational aspects of our democracy.
Right.
Donald Trump's being pretty explicit that him coming back in 2024 is a vote for revenge and autocracy.
Right.
And, I think that when you talk about, how we defeat this, the answer is, not one big thing, but a lot of little things. It is saying, violence doesn't have a place in American politics.
Right.
Again, as we're recording this on Monday, a couple of hours ago, some guy with a baseball bat stormed into Congressman Jerry Connolly's office in Northern Virginia and assaulted two of his staff. We don't know the
Nancy
ideology.
Pelosi's husband was hit in the head with a hammer, right?
We don't know right. We don't know the ideology of that attack, but we should all, regardless of party, condemn attacks on members of Congress staff.
Really, anyone, right?
Yeah. You shouldn't really be taking a baseball bat to anyone, regardless of the circumstances in the politics. Right. And that, this is a prosecution question that, the people who step out and conduct these acts need to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I'm really heartened by the pretty quick verdicts of seditious conspiracy against both the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys.
Right.
Which, again, if you listen to the whole Long Shadow podcast season, that's the U.S. government typically doesn't get those cases right. In this case, we did.
Right.
And, Stuart Rhodes, the head of the Oath Keepers, is going to be going away probably for a really long time. Provided Donald Trump is not reelected in 18 months. And
because he said he'd pardon them all.
And he'll pardon all 1,000 people convicted of or charged in January 6th. So this is something where there's a prosecution element, there's a rhetoric element. This is you need to not vote for people who believe that violence has an important part in American history or
Right.
in American politics. We need to turn out the worst of the election deniers, which America largely did in 2022. I hope that trend continues.
Right.
But we are very much still in this fight, as you said, and it's not going to be over in 2 years or probably 5 years at this point.
Right. I always remember that scene in the movie Patton, right, where it's the Battle of the Bulge, and they're all in this, he and the other generals are all in this thing, and he said, I can move these guys in 12 hours, where nobody can do that. He said, well, here's the thing I know is that we could still lose this war, right? He had no illusions about what they were up against. Thankfully, they got there. The 101st held out and they ran out of gas, right? Thankfully for all those things. But Garrett, I think that's right. And I think this is the part too that's, I think most important, which is, it's easy for you and me to sit here on this live stream and say, be not afraid, right? But that's the other part too, which is fear is a key component of this stuff, which is, did the shooters in El Paso or, San Diego County or Tree of Life or Buffalo know each other? Not personally, but they all lived in an orbit together. But their individual acts are part of something bigger, and that part of something bigger is keeping us all scared, keeping our heads down, maybe keeping us in our homes, keeping us disengaged or disengaging us because they know, the bad guys know, that if you're disengaged, you're more likely to say, I don't want to hear about it, I don't want to see it, I just want the storm to pass me by.
Yes. And this is, there's some, whatever that saying is, all that's required for the bad guys to win is for the good guys to do nothing.
Right.
It is, I think one of the things that we really struggle with is, this really is a very concerted movement. It's very organized. I said to you before we got on the air, I started this season, 9 months ago, researching this, with the entire premise of the second season of Long Shadow being, this is all one story over 40 years. All of these things, Ruby Ridge, Waco, Oklahoma City, the Bundys are related to January 6th, Donald Trump, the modern far-right extremism. And I was still shocked over the course of my research and the interviews that we did to see just how linear a story this really is, of 40 years of a movement that and you mentioned this a little bit, a movement that really sort of starts in the 50s and 60s with the Birchers and the old KKK, moves to the point in the Republican Party where they get Donald Trump as their nominee in 2016 and deliver, him to the White House. This is something that, some people have been very carefully thinking about for as long as you and I have been alive.
Right. And, I think there's a better than average chance, maybe an overwhelming chance, he'll be their nominee again in 2024. Yes. All right. Well, listen, this has been, just an incredible conversation for my part, Garrett, but where can our folks find the podcast? Where can they find you online?
So the podcast is Long Shadow. It is available wherever you find your podcasts. It is the second season. The first season is worth listening to as well. It's it's looking at the lingering questions of 9/11, which is the subject of one of my other books. Questions like, what was the target of Flight 93, who was the 20th hijacker, what was the Saudi connection to 9/11. Right. And then this second season, Rise of the American Far Right, is unfolding right now. It's 7 episodes. We've got the 6th episode coming out on Wednesday, May 17th, and then the final episode coming next week for our time. As we're recording this on Monday, May 15th. And then I'm Vermont GMG on Twitter, and you can also find me. I write a newsletter called Doomsday Scenario, which you can sign up for on my website, garrettgraff.com, GarrettGraff.com.
Perfect. Yes. Tune in, listen to both seasons immediately, get them on your phone or wherever you listen to your podcast. Get Garrett's newsletter as well. As always, gang, you can find me on Twitter and TikTok at Reed Galen, on Instagram at Reed_Galen_LP. If you are watching this video right now on YouTube, hit that subscribe button to the Lincoln Project YouTube channel. We'd love it if you join us. And if you're just new to the podcast, please go back and listen. This episode I'm recording now with Garrett, and the last two have been a 3-episode arc on right-wing extremism from different perspectives, and I hope that you will download those and listen to them. Garrett Graff, thank you as always. Everybody else, I'll see you next time.